Safer Chemicals Podcast. Sound science on harmful chemicals.
Welcome to the Safer Chemicals Podcast. My name is Päivi Jokiniemi. Today we'll talk about this year's last Biocidal Products Committee meeting, and our main topic will be the committee's opinion on the comparative assessment of anticoagulant rodenticides. If you listened to our September episode, you already got some background to this, but if you missed it, don't worry, we'll give you a full update. We'll also discuss the most interesting opinions on active substances and hear how the committee is planning to harmonise and streamline its processes to get ready for the future workload. And as usual, I am joined by Erik van de Plassche, the chair of the committee. Welcome, Erik, and thanks for being here.
Good to see you, Päivi.
As promised, so let's start with the comparative assessment of anticoagulant rodenticides. So you already had quite a comprehensive debate on this in your September meeting, where the different alternatives were discussed. And now it was time to agree on your recommendation. So I have two questions for you. Did you reach a conclusion, and how was the debate that led to your opinion?
Yes, indeed, Päivi, this one was the main topic, I would say, the most interesting opinion which we discussed this meeting, which was, by the way, our first in-person meeting after a long time. So it was very good that members were there in person in Helsinki to discuss this topic. First of all, we agreed on the opinion. So we adopted the opinion by not by consensus. There was one minority opinion expressed by the German authorities, but good to see that we adopted this opinion, and that can then form the basis indeed for the renewal of the AVK rodenticides, which is going to take place soon. This opinion was a bit special in a sense that we had a heavy involvement of stakeholders. Normally we have stakeholders who are involved in the production, the manufacturing, the formulation of active substances or biocidal products. But this time we also had stakeholders who are involved in pest control, and they represent, let's say, something like thousands of companies who are involved in pest control. We had Biocides for Europe, Cefic, who is representing the manufacturers of active substances, but also the formulators. But they also have some of their clients they mentioned who are also involved in using rodent traps. And then we had two producers of rodent traps, mechanical traps, and they also informed the meeting about their background and also informed us that they are going to form an association. So they might be in the future an ECHA stakeholder. Maybe to start off is the discussion we had on chemical alternatives, because the comparative assessment is related to looking at chemical alternatives and looking at non-chemical alternatives for these AVK rodenticides. For chemical alternatives, we didn't have that much discussion after the last meeting. There are some chemical alternatives which have been identified, and these are alpha-chloralose, cholecalciferol, and carbon dioxide. And they can be alternatives for indoor control of mice or for what is called permanent baiting. I'll come back on that later. Not all of them, let's say, but for example, carbon dioxide can only be an alternative for permanent baiting. There was some discussion, I must say, about are these really better in terms of their profile, because what you never want when you go to a comparative assessment is that you have something like regrettable substitution. So you're substituted by an alternative which is, in hindsight, not really better. And for cholecalciferol and alpha-chloralose, we are not fully sure whether these are really better alternatives. And that has to do, for example, for alpha-chloralose with the fact that recently there have been cases of pet poisoning identified. It may be a PBT, but we have to assess that during the renewal process. And cholecalciferol is, for example, an endocrine disruptor, while the AVK rodenticides have not been assessed with respect to that property. But overall, the conclusion on chemical alternatives, I think, was clear and straightforward. Then we move to the discussion on the non-chemical alternatives, the rodent traps, and that was the main debate of the meeting. In fact, there were two main issues. The one was what is called permanent baiting. I already referred to that. And that is a use which we added to the opinion based on the discussion in the September meeting. So you have curative methods which you use when you have an infestation, but permanent baiting is a preventive method. And there are many situations where permanent baiting can be used, for example, in the food industry, in shops, for example, in sewer systems. But it's a controversial use, for sure, with AVK rodenticides, as it is thought to be leading to resistance problems, but also to primary and secondary poisoning. And for that reason, permanent baiting with AVK rodenticide is banned in some member states, but not in all. And also member states have sometimes approved chemical alternatives, so cholecalciferol and alpha-chlorelose, for example, are used for permanent baiting in some member states. But as said, it is a controversial application. But as said, we added it to the comparative assessment. And as a consequence of that, we had to look into whether the use of rodent traps is effective for permanent baiting. And the issue there was that we have limited information on the effectiveness of using traps for this use. And to make it even more complicated, it's very difficult to assess the effectiveness also of chemicals for permanent baiting. Because as you maybe can understand, if you have an infestation, you can use your rodenticides and then you can, let's say, measure whether there are less rats in the end and whether the infestation is disappearing. But permanent baiting is very difficult to assess because, in principle, your rodent should not be there. So what has been done, and that was a test which we received very late, just before the meeting, by a company who is involved in the production of rodent traps. They compared in the food industry the use of AVK rodenticides and traps for certain sites. In total there were 16. And they just observed whether the bait was consumed for the AVK rodenticides and looked over the year whether in these traps mice were caught. The meeting concluded, well, there is evidence that it might be efficacious. There are even doubts whether it's efficacious, even for AVK rodenticides. It was a limited test. There was, let's say, it was not published in a peer-reviewed journal. This was a study summary together with some, let's say, some results, the raw data as we call it. So not easy to assess by the members, and also combined with the whole controversy about permanent baiting, what we concluded in the end is that our conclusion is in fact inconclusive, that we don't know at the moment whether rodent traps are effective and efficacious for permanent baiting, that for sure there is a need to discuss this at a more regulatory level because of the concerns also with permanent baiting in general, and that there are also ongoing, let's say, activities going on. So, for example, the coordination group is looking into resistance problems with permanent baiting. And the efficacy working group has discussed recently also how to look at effectiveness for rodenticides for this use. And they also could not come to a conclusion. So that was for us a reason, let's not conclude. We described the whole issue, we described the pros and cons, and then we will finalize the opinion in that sense. And that was a reason for Germany, to be clear, to file a minority opinion because they consider that rodent traps are effective. At this moment of time, we can already take that conclusion. And that would, of course, have its consequence for the product renewal. The next one then, the most important debate we had was about the use of rodent traps for indoor control of mice. There was one test available, a test carried out inside a farm, which proved that the rodent trap which was used in that situation was effective. And we have agreed EU guidance on how to test the effectiveness of rodent traps, which is called the Nocero guidance. So the test was carried out according to those guidelines. But the issue was, is this sufficient to conclude that rodent traps are effective for indoor control of mice? And then there are several questions. So, for example, we only had one type of trap which was tested, and there are more traps on the market in the EU, in fact, worldwide. And there has been a big, let's say, improvement in the development of rodent traps. Everybody is aware of that, and that was, of course, also, let's say, highlighted by these producers of rodent traps. But in fact, only one trap was tested in this specific test. So, do we need to test more traps? The other question was, do we need to test more situations? The test was about a farm. Do we need to test also, for example, in residential areas? So, indeed, do we consider this one test sufficient? And the last one, which was debated, is we can have different types of infestations. So you can have let's say, a light infestation up to a heavy infestation. And there were concerns expressed by, in this stakeholder consultation which we had, that for heavy infestations, rodent traps might have its disadvantages. Maybe they're effective, but maybe there are practical and economic disadvantages. And that's a general issue we had, in fact, in this opinion. We had several times, we had statements from stakeholders where they had, let's say, conflicting statements about the use of mechanical traps or rodent traps. And it was very difficult to bring those together because we have limited information. That's, for me, one of the most important aspects, that we need more information to come to conclusions in the future. We also looked at what do we do for AVK rodenticides. And in the end, it was decided by the committee that this one test we had is sufficient to conclude that for indoor control you can use these traps. There were concerns expressed by stakeholders, but in the end, the committee decided that rodent traps are a suitable alternatives for indoor control of mice.
Good. What happens now next?
The Commission has to prepare now a decision based on this opinion. Maybe first to say it's a part of the mandate which we received. So one element is the comparative assessment. The other one is the comparison within the group of AVK rodenticides, whether one is better than the other. That part we will take later in the June meeting of next year. But based on this comparative assessment, which we now finalized, the Commission has to prepare a decision, and that will in fact be a kind of, let's say, summary, of course, of the opinion. So laying down again the conclusions of the opinion, and then some recommendations, I guess, for member states on how to move forward with the product renewals. The other thing which is important is how to deal with the upcoming new information. So as said, there will be new information. The producers of rodent traps are doing more tests for other type of traps, for other situations. That's also not only the rodent trap producers, but also the let's call it the chemical industry. So they will also look at outdoor uses. They will more look at rats. The information we had now clearly showed that rodent traps cannot be used for rat control, but more tests will be done in that respect. So we have to decide how to, let's say, take that information into consideration. Will we have a kind of submission? Will it be to ECHA? Will it be to the Commission? How will we amalgamate this? Will we have again a kind of a opinion, conclusion, whatever? So that's something we will need to discuss. And maybe the last one interesting to mention is that we also had some debate on rodent traps and whether there is a need for a kind of an authorization scheme. And this has been debated already for, let's say, years when this topic is coming more and more to the forefront. There is a kind of authorization scheme in Germany, if I'm correct. And the request from, some of the members was, will this be taken further? But in that sense, the Commission made clear that they have no intention to take this up, related mainly to, let's say, there's enough on their plate in terms of, we all know the review program, authorisations, etc. So this is a topic they will not pick up when they receive the opinion on this comparative assessment for rodenticides.
Good. So some discussion continues still in the June meeting, but otherwise we can say that the comparative assessment is now done, and then we close this book and open it again in, was it 5 years?
Yes, indeed. When the AVK rodenticides will be renewed, of course, first we'll have the renewal of the active substances, which will need to be done. But assuming they again will all meet the exclusion criteria, and I'm sure they do, we will have another comparative assessment of rodenticides in something like 5 years.
Okay, thanks so much for that. I think we can now move on to the next topic, and that would be the guidance on analysis of alternatives. There hasn't been one specific for biocides earlier, so ECHA was tasked to draft one, and now you're about to finalize it. So to recap, what's the purpose of this guidance, and what can you tell about the timing? When will it be published?
Yeah, the purpose of the guidance is to provide guidance for applicants and for the evaluating competent authorities, so for member states, on how to perform the analysis of alternatives. And as you said, indeed, there was no guidance before. Under REACH, there is guidance, and that's what we took, let's say, as a basis for the guidance for biocides. But there was nothing before, and there was a clear request from all parties to have something in place also for biocides. And that has been picked up by ECHA because it also has, already for years been a clear signal that we need to improve on the analysis of alternatives, which is performed for active substances who are a candidate for substitution. And it's even more relevant for active substances who are considered to be meeting the exclusion criteria. So the idea was to have guidance on where do you need to look at when you perform an analysis of alternatives. So that's, for example, at the does an alternative reduce the risks? What's its feasibility in terms of technicality, but also in terms of economics? So these criteria, let's say, have been addressed in the guidance, not laid down, but there is a description on what kind of criteria you need to look at. And that's not really something new, but it was good to have it. And then it also lays down formats, how would you gather information when you perform the analysis, and also what is the role of the applicant and the role of the member state competent authority in this whole process. So we had a revised version for this meeting, and in the end that was agreed by the members. We will now finalize it. We will publish it maybe before the end of this year, for sure in the beginning of next year. But the main debate in the meeting was about its, let's say, its applicability and when are we going to apply it, and something which I would call expectation management, because there were concerns from some of the member states, but also from the industry who was present, that, as we all know, not all active substances have been approved. There's a lot of activities which has to be performed by member states and by industry. For example, for certain product types, we have not evaluated 50% of them. So how can we know what kind of alternatives there are on the market when we have not even assessed the majority of them? That's just one of the elements, to be clear, where yes, we can have a certain, let's say, ambition, but the reality might be different. So that's something which we recognized as an agency, and where we also, let's say, have laid down in the guidance what we call a flexible approach. So we have, to our understanding, responded to those requests, but still there remain concerns from member states and stakeholders. So that's why we will prepare a note for the next competent authority meeting, where we will discuss or will have some proposals on the implementation of the guidance, meaning when will we start applying it, and also being more clear on for what kind of situations do we really need it. For example, and I think that everybody agrees to, when a substance is meeting the exclusion criteria, we have to do it, there's no doubt about it. But for other situations, we might be more flexible. So that's going to be another debate on it, and maybe that's good that we await the outcome of that debate before we finalize the guidance. Now I speak of it, so maybe January is a more realistic timeline for publishing this guidance.
And that will then be available on our website?
Yes, that will be for sure published on the ECHA website.
Very good. So what would you like to highlight from the active substance approvals this time?
Yeah, not that much compared to last time. We had two substances. One of them was what is called, it used to be called BARDAP 26, but that substance has been renamed, and now it's called DMPAP for the experts in the room. But this redefinition is important because you will soon then have two names, so we need to harmonize that. Of course, now we have renamed this substance. But that was approved for product type 2 and 4. That's a quaternary ammonium compound. We have already many in our program. And this was, let's say, just another one which is very similar to similar substances we have already seen. So approved without too much discussion and debate.
And product type 2 and 4 were?
That's disinfectants. Disinfectants, yes. And then we had chrysanthemum extracts. We have two different ones with different extraction methods, where the evaluating CA was Spain, and they came back to our meeting. We discussed them some meetings ago, where we had an outstanding issue on the risk assessment for sediment. We allowed the applicant to provide more data, because otherwise we were, let's say, afraid that these substances would not be approved. And looking at their profile, the meeting was convinced that we should approve these substances. So exceptionally, the applicant was given the possibility to submit these data. And that had now been done, and Spain had looked at those data, they performed a risk assessment, and they also proposed an approval, which was accepted by the meeting, although there was discussion around what is called large-scale application of these insecticides. It's PT18. And that's an outdoor use, and large-scale, you can think about woodlands, you can think about rice lands in the southern part of Europe. And there are indeed insecticides which are used for these type of applications. And there was a guidance developed by our environment working group looking at these type of applications. And the issue was a bit that looking at the profile of these substances, remember these are insecticides, so for sure they have effects on target organisms, but may also, and I guess in most cases they have, also effect on what is called non-target organisms. And the issue was whether we would go that far that we would already not approve these type of applications based on this, the fact that these are insecticides and the fact that we're dealing with large scale, in contrast to, for example, indoor use. And there in the end, the meeting decided, we should not do this. it's also a discussion which is related to the ongoing development of guidance on pollinators, where we are working with EFSA on a guidance for the biocidal use. And that means that in the near future we will have a scenario to assess quantitatively and qualitatively the risk for pollinators. And we also will have a guidance on whether we can introduce risk management measures for these type of applications. And as for this type of application, we did not have the method. We did not have sufficient, let's say, information. We did not look into the possibility of of introducing risk mitigation measures. We decided let's not preempt that, let's say, that discussion and that scenario which will become available. Let's approve these substances, but for sure when product authorization will come and there will be an application for this large scale, then that's something which will need to have, which will need to be followed.
All right. Then at the end of the meeting, you discussed how to streamline and harmonise the application processes and how companies can submit further information on their cases. Was there an agreement on this, and is there a specific reason why the committee feels that there needs to be some specification on this?
Yeah, first of all, we agreed on all the documents we put forward, and they all came from the agency, from MECA, from the Secretariat, and they were prepared because we saw a need to streamline and harmonize the practice. So we saw different practices within member states. We saw some differences between active substance approval and union authorization, and without a clear reason for having these different practices. So the idea behind it was to harmonize, to streamline, and also lay down, let's say we moved, for example, from, we moved to another IT system, let's call it that. So also these things needed to be laid down in our working procedures. So we had several documents. The working procedure on active substances, the working procedure on union authorization, which was agreed upon. We have a guidance now on how to deal with new information within the union authorization and active substance process. That was a document which was already there, adopted years ago by the committee, and that has now been updated, so there is a revised version of that. And it combines active substance and union authorization. So we have one document for both processes. And then we had a last document which was about union authorization and then how to handle information provided by an applicant from the submission until the adoption of the committee opinion. So then you talk about the validation process, the evaluation process by the ECA, and then last, the opinion forming or peer review process. Still, I would say there are concerns expressed by stakeholders, by CEFIC, for example, but also by other stakeholders. They have concerns that these documents are, I would say, a bit too strict, so that their right to be heard is to a certain extent compromised by these more strict processes and procedures. But from our side, we would say the main intention is to harmonize and to streamline. So we would not, let's say, agree with these kind of statements which were made in the committee. And then last to say about this, the Commission made an intervention that it would be good also now to look at national authorization. So we have this practice now for union. It would also be good to see whether we can apply the same principles, and by nature, of course, we do. What we do for union, we should also do for national. So also look at these kind of principles and guidelines for national authorization. So that's something we have to pick up as an agency.
This was the last meeting of this year. There was one important announcement made in this meeting, and it's about some changes taking place next year. Could you please tell a little bit more about this?
Yes, I can tell for sure. So I announced at the meeting that I will leave the agency. So, as you may know, I moved to the Netherlands with my family, and living and working in 2 countries is something which is in the end not sustainable from all perspectives. So that's why I decided to leave the agency. And that will mean that the next meeting will not be my last one in March, but the one in June. That will be the last meeting for me. And after that, 1 month later, I will definitely move back to the Netherlands.
And what happens now? I guess we will need to find a new chair for the committee.
Yeah, we need a new chair, but I can say that the vacancy notice is already published on the website of the agency.
So everyone should then keep their eyes open and go and have a look at it if you're interested. Thank you again, Erik, for joining us. And as you said, despite the announcement, we will have Erik back with us at least for a couple of more episodes next year. Until then, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast at eka.europa.eu/podcasts. And we are also collecting feedback to be able to better meet your needs in the future. So please fill in our short feedback form that you can find in the episode description. Thanks for listening.
Safer Chemicals Podcast. Sound science on harmful chemicals.